Hi! Welcome to a new episode of History in 7 Facts, the show that aims to explore some interesting episodes of humanity's past. Check out this playlist to watch the entire series, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. The Grand Soviet Union, one of the greatest powers that ever existed on Earth. It was supposed to be a workers' paradise, a new dawn for humanity. Instead, it was a repressive regime that lied and killed anyone that dared to speak up. And even the Union's beginning was a lie. The Great October Revolution that instated the Bolsheviks in power entered the history books as a bloody but heroic revolt of the people. In reality, it was nothing more than a clumsy coup d'etat that was hardly noticed even while it was going on. On the night of October 24, 1917, there was nothing special going on in Petrograd, today's St. Petersburg. The restaurants were full, theaters were open, and the only incidents of the night were the arrest of 2 drunk soldiers. If we believe the Soviet version of history, all these people missed one of the greatest events in the city's history. Tens of thousands of workers and soldiers stormed the Winter Palace and won against the government forces. Despite the heavy losses, it was a glorious victory, inspired by the leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, and carried out by the proletariat. Since then, this revolt was presented as the greatest triumph of the people, unequaled in history. But this is all a lie. The entire event was nothing more than a military coup d'etat, and a weak one at that somehow succeeded despite the laughable incompetence of their leaders. This coup was transformed into a great popular revolt against the aristocratic government of Russia. The school books presented an event together with its many heroic acts that never actually happened. The truth came out only after 1991, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed. But even today, this truth is hard to accept by the people who were told an entirely different story for generations. The events that took place in that October were following a very rough year for the Russian Empire. In the spring, the violent popular revolts were stopped with gunfire and many victims. The Russian army suffered several defeats in World War I. The Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, thus bringing the 300-year-old dynasty of the Romanovs to an end. He was replaced by an interim government led by Alexander Kerensky. His government basically couldn't decide whether to pull the country out of the war or not. This led to even more discontent and desertion in the army. The political parties were more busy fighting amongst themselves, and only one party advocated for peace: the Russian Socialist Democratic Labour Party, the Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, they were recruiting their own army, the Red Guard, planning to take over the government as soon as they could. They planned the revolt to be attempted on October 24, and by lunchtime it was supposed to be done. But there was no revolt. Kerensky's government held its regular meetings in the Winter Palace, the former residence of the Tsar and the new seat of the provisional government. At a meeting of the Soviets, Lenin actually lied that the government already fell, when in reality their plan was descending into total chaos. The first problem was with their troops. They were planning to use sailors from the Baltic Fleet, but they were late. When they did arrive, their rifles were jammed. The Winter Palace was supposed to be bombed by artillery from the Petropavlovskaya fortress from across the river. The fortress was under Bolshevik control, but there was a problem. The commander, Blagon Ravov, discovered that the artillery was just for show. They weren't usable. Instead, they found some 8mm cannons in the courtyard, but they didn't have the manpower to position them. So the commander himself rushed to find some extra hands. The problems didn't end here. A red lamp was supposed to be lit and hanged on a mast when the cannons were ready to fire. At this signal, the Aurora battleship would fire some warning shots to scare the ministers and force their capitulation. If they wouldn't surrender, the cannons would open fire, followed by the battleship. But they couldn't find the red lamp. They did find a lamp, but it wasn't red and it couldn't be placed on the mast. Oh, but it gets better. The cannons were rusted and haven't been oiled in a long while. They could have exploded from the first shot. All the while, the city was quiet and unaware of what's going on. Blagon Ravov wanted to inspect his troops himself, but he got lost in the corridors of the fortress. He finally managed to find his troops and cannons and soon realized that he basically needed volunteers that were willing to sacrifice their lives in order to shoot the cannons. In the meantime, Prime Minister Kerensky already left the palace in search of military support. Those that remained were ill-equipped to defend the building and afraid of what's about to happen. But the exchange of fire was sporadic at best. At this stage, Lenin was mad with rage and the Bolsheviks were getting demotivated. By nightfall, the Winter Palace had at most 300 people in it, a few cadets and a women's battalion. Many fled out of fear, others out of hunger. The palace had very little food reserves. So the reality was that the Bolsheviks could have stormed the palace at any given moment. There was no one to put up a proper defense. But because their plan was so miserably flawed, the Bolsheviks were now demotivated and kept postponing the assault until early morning. At 1830, they gave the government an ultimatum: surrender or be bombarded. The ministers didn't know that the artillery from the Petropavlovskaya fortress were not functional and that the battleship had blank ammunition. But even so, they didn't surrender. At 11 o'clock in the evening, the cannons were finally in place and the commander actually managed to recruit men willing to die for the cause. They fired some 30 shots at the palace, but only 2 actually hit the target. A small fire started after the shots, but it was put out fast. The sailors and Red Guards entered the palace, followed by looters. In the last moments of the provisional government, there was a lot of chaos and fear, and they decided to surrender. There was no use to put up a fight, the bloodshed would have been useless. And that was the entire October Revolution. By 2 AM the ministers were captured and arrested and the whole deed was done. There was no heroic storming of the palace, no waves of workers fighting for their communist dream, just a weak military coup, a couple of arrests and 5 casualties. But revolutions need heroes. In 1920, a huge spectacle called the Assault on the Winter Palace was put on stage, right in front of the Winter Palace. 100,000 people were there to watch the show. 8,000 actors and 500 musicians were performing in front of them. The blurry pictures taken from this show later became official photographs from the revolution. And the lie became the uncontested truth. Thank you for watching this episode of 7 Facts. I hope this was interesting and informative, and maybe it even inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you like this video, please thumbs up and subscribe. While you're downstairs, let me know what you think about this video. Please consider visiting my Patreon page and become a patron. The link is in the description. I hope to see you next time. Bye.